Welcome back to our generic crafting tutorial series. In this episode, we are going to be building our vendors. So, just like the banker out in the world, we're going to have an NPC vendor, and they're going to have an inventory and an amount of money, and we're going to buy and sell things with the vendor. So what I'm actually going to do here is I'm going to duplicate my banker. I'm going to call this BP vendor. And you're probably wondering why I don't use an NPC base class, and that's because all of these things do slightly different functionality. I think it's easier to just duplicate them in my case. If you want to make a base class of them, you're free to do that. But I think duplication is perfectly fine here. So I'm going to duplicate this. The interaction event is going to be exactly the same. We're going to go to the PC custom and display the transfer widget like we do with everything else. Our begin play is going to do something a little bit different. We're going to, instead of load bank data, we're going to load vendor data. And then we're going to delay a tick. And we're going to need a custom event. Whoops, sorry. Delay until next tick. We need a custom event here called check resupply ready. So, if I can type ready. So just like with our gathering nodes, there's going to be a timer function here that is going to determine whether or not the vendor is going to resupply. So you can do that daily, hourly, weekly, whatever you want. We're going to set that up later. We're just going to check right here, check resupply ready. Just know that we're going to run that function after we've loaded the vendor data and delayed a tick. This is also going to be called save vendor data. And we are going to do these things in just a minute. They're not going to do any of this stuff. These are going to be totally unique to the vendor. We also need our interaction events. So the one interaction event we are not going to have here is the increase inventory size. We can go ahead and delete that. But we still need add item. We still need adjust currency. We still need remove item. And we still need save inventory to now save the vendor data. So that's why we duplicated there. All those events are going to be exactly the same. We're going to go into our interface, and we are going to go into our getter here for get interaction data. Make sure our interaction type is switched to vendor. And get transfer details as well is going to make sure that we switch that to vendor. All this stuff here is going to be exactly the same though, except for our transfer title, which we're going to make in just a moment. So for our vendor, we're going to need quite a few setup variables, right? And this is going to be different from our banker in that way. So our setup variables here are going to be basically the inventory info from the structure we're about to create. So each vendor is going to have a base inventory amount, so all of the objects that they would normally carry in their inventory, and an amount of currency. So if you want that to be adjustable during gameplay, that's something you're kind of going to have to decide based on your game. But for us, we're going to keep it simple, and they're just going to have a static inventory that refreshes periodically. So we're going to make a new structure here called svendor save data. And this is going to be kind of like the storage chests where they had to have a unique ID in order to properly save and load. Our svendor save data is going to have a unique ID to properly save and load. And we're going to use this for the vendor restock data table as well. So what we're going to have here is first our unique ID. This is going to be a name. And just like everything else, this unique ID is also going to be the data table row that we get for the vendor. We're going to have inventory. This is going to be an array of inventory info. So this will work for the saved vendor inventory and the restock from the data table. We're going to have a currency amount. This can just be an integer. To make our lives easier, we're going to have a vendor display name. This is going to be a string, and this is going to be the display name for the vendor. This just makes our life a little bit easier to have this in the vendor save data when we set up the data table. Then we're going to have another value here called last replen, or whatever you want to call it. And this is the date time that the vendor was last refreshed. And we're going to be using, just like we did with the nodes, we're going to be using UTC local. to get the real date time of the resets here. If you want to use in-game time, then you're going to have to set up a whole game time system to be using that. We're just going to use date time to keep it simple. Okay, so now that we have that S vendor save data, we're going to make our data table. And this is just for easier setup. Data table, easier setup and adjustments of S vendor save data. We call DT vendor restock. And this is going to be all the default values for the vendor. So I will have this data table public in the description for you. And this is basically just, we only set up 5 vendors here, so unique ID being 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The items from the data table that they're going to have on hand, and how much currency they're going to have on hand, and their display name. We don't actually need replan time here. It will handle that, as you'll see right here. So we're going to see our comma separated values. We can just call that sheet 1, even though I already have it saved. Yes.
Power on. I'll take a land.
Don't mind that. Yes, we're just going to save that as vendor sheet 1. Go ahead and put that back on my other screen here. And we're going to re-import vendor sheet 1. Expected column last replan not found, and that's because we don't need the last replan time for this. That's only going to be relevant when we actually save the vendor data. So just kind of something to keep in mind here. So now that we have these all set up, we can go ahead and close out of them. And we can go back into our vendor here and start setting up our variables. So just like our crafting nodes, we're going to need our unique ID. And this unique ID is just going to be the name, and it's going to be that same data table row. Now if you have multiple vendors that are going to be pulling off of the same data table, then if you use the same unique ID, it is going to load that unique data from the vendor data table. So that's just something to keep in mind. If you have West City, Real Goods Inc. and East City Real Goods Inc., you're probably going to want to make them a different data table row if you want them to be different values. So we're going to make sure that's instance and exposed, and that is going to be in the setup category. We're going to add another one called Resupply frequency. And that is going to be how often this vendor refreshes. We're going to do it every 10 minutes, so we'll do 600 seconds. We'll probably actually do it every minute. That way we have some kind of real... We don't have to wait 10 minutes to actually check that it's working. I have a boolean here called use total refresh. This boolean is going to determine whether or not we just straight up get the inventory data from the data table, or if we get that inventory and add it to the vendor's inventory. This is kind of a one-off thing. This is if you want vendors to, for whatever reason, have a cumulative inventory. Not something you necessarily need to do, but it's something I did in my project just to give you the option of having a cumulative inventory for the vendors. We're going to have another one. It's going to be called B use data table, and this is going to determine whether or not you want to use that data table we just imported. So maybe you want to drag all your vendors out into the world and set them all up manually. That's going to be what this boolean here determines. That way you're not like forced to use a data table if you really don't want to use the data table. We're going to have another one called vendor defaults, and that is going to be of the type that we just made, vendor save data. And that's going to be so you can manually set up the vendor data if you want to. Yeah, I get it. You can't parse the value for true. Sometimes that happens. Just go ahead and resave. And everything else we will set up as we go along. So just know that those are kind of the values here. So if I drag my vendor out into the world, we can see that we have the unique ID. We're going to give this the unique ID of 1. We have the resupply frequency, we have the total refresh, use data table, and if you wanted to, instead of using the data table, you would set that to false and you would set up the vendor defaults here. Okay, so back inside of our vendor, we need to go ahead and set up the save game details. So all the stuff that is going to need to be saved in the save game and how we're kind of going to handle that. So for our load vendor data, we are going to need to make an array inside of our save game ref, just like we've done with everything else so far, for all of the saved vendor data. So we're going to go into our game, go into our save custom, and we are going to add a new variable called saved vendor data. And that is going to be of the type s underscore vendor save data, and that's going to be an array. And we're going to put this in the category of vendor. So just like we did with our storage chests, we need to find the index of the vendor based on its unique ID. And that is basically going to be almost the exact same functionality here. So we're going to duplicate it and call it find vendor index. And we're going to put this in the category of vendor instead of storage. That way we don't get confused. And instead of using storage chest, that is going to use vendor data. And it's going to break that. So we need to go ahead and decouple this. And now we need to break out this array element, because this is vendor save data, not chest save data. And it's going to be the same thing here. We're going to pass in the unique ID for the vendor. We're going to check and see if the vendor data array inside of our save game actually contains any vendor data attached to that unique ID. If it does, we're going to set the local chest index to whatever the index is for that item, and we're going to return it. Okay, pretty much exactly the same thing as we did for chests. So for our vendor, that's the first thing we need to do, is we need to find vendor index, and we're going to take that unique ID, and just like we did with chests, we are going to promote this to a variable. We're going to take all that stuff and we're going to drag it over here, because we don't need it yet. We will need it. We don't need it yet. First we need to promote this to a variable called chest index. Yeah, that's fine. And we can put this in the category of info or whatever you want. Just kind of keep it private so that you're not trying to set this manually anywhere. We need to see if this is equal to -1. And if this is equal to -1, we need to restore the defaults, or basically set up all of this stuff with the vendor defaults from the data table. Okay? So we're going to take our, let's just take our vendor defaults here, and we'll make sure that we set this up beforehand, so we'll break that. And we'll just use these vendor defaults to set our inventory content, and set our currency. Vendors are not going to have an inventory size. That way you can sell as many items as you want. So make sure you go over to inventory and keep use inventory size as false. Did I ever actually set that up in my banker? Hold on. I want to make sure that we actually set that in the banker to use inventory size. Oh, whoops. Use inventory size true here. Just to make sure that we are using inventory size with our banker. I'm going to set that something like 25 as default. I know we've already bought a bunch of slots, so it's probably 1,000,000. Just something I guess I forgot to do when we made the banker. It's a good thing I checked when I did the vendor. The vendor is not going to use inventory size. And I'm going to show you in just a minute how we're going to make sure that is all set up. And that is all we need to do here, is just set the load inventory and the currency values from the vendor defaults. Now if that is false, that means that we actually have the proper index in our save game. So we need to get our vendor data. Oops. And we need to get a copy of that vendor data at that index. And we need to go ahead and load that out. So we're going to break it. We're going to load that in here. But actually, instead of doing all that, let's not do this off of true. And we will just set our vendor no, we won't set our vendor. Never mind. We don't want to set our vendor defaults. I'm lying to you. We'll just set all that up. So plug in currency, plug in inventory, and we'll handle those vendor defaults later. We also want to set our last resupply time, because maybe we saved this and we're pretty much only going to save this if the resupply time is valid. So we need to promote this to a variable called last replen or last resupply time. That's just going to be an info, and that needs to get set here. Because again, if we have saved vendor data, that means we have a last replenishment time. If the vendor data is default, we're going to run a check on that, and we're just not going to save it at all. That way we don't have a bunch of vendors with default data saved for no reason inside of our save game object. Okay, and that is all we're going to do off of load. So event begin play is going to load the vendor data and check the resupply ready. And we're just going to have to pull these vendor defaults if we are using the data table. So we'll do that in the construction script. We'll get BU's data table. And if we are using the data table, we will get data table row for the vendor unique ID. And we'll set that to the vendor defaults. That way we're doing this on construction script, so we're always going to have valid defaults. If that is false, we're not going to do anything. That means you wanted to manually set up the vendor defaults, right? That's all we need to do there. I'm going to pull this down because I want load to be separate from save. So that's all we're going to do on load. Now on save, we are going to need another custom function inside of our save game ref. And that is going to be called set vendor data. So I'm just going to make a new function here called set vendor data. And that's going to be in the vendor category as well. And basically all this is going to do is take an input value for that structure. And it's going to run some checks to see if we need to add that. I'm going to call that vendor to save. I'm going to break that open. We need to see first if this vendor is already existing inside of this array. And since we just saved that index, we can go ahead and pull it. So we'll just pull that, or I should say in index, not L index. So we'll just go ahead and pull that index like we did with the chests. So we will come out of here and say set vendor data. And we will take that index that we just set when we loaded, and we'll pull that in. That way we can just check and see if this is equal to -1. Just like we did with the chests, if this is equal to -1, then we don't need to do any extra logic. We can just add straight to our vendor data this new vendor save. And if that is true, and return with the new index. And we're going to say out index. If that is not true, that means we already have this inside of the vendor data. So we're going to take our vendor data again, and we're just going to set array element using the input index. So we're going to get in index. That way we don't have, we don't have strings everywhere. And I'm just going to go ahead and get vendor to save, and I am going to plug that in here. We don't actually need this. We're going to duplicate that and plug it in up here, so we don't need to run a bunch of logic here. Basically, we're just going to be seeing if the index that we've already pulled, since we've already found the vendor index. If we did not find the vendor index, that means we don't have this vendor saved, and we need to go ahead and add it to the save array when we save. And if we already have it saved, then we just need to set the array element. And same as we did with the chests, we're going to go ahead and return in index if we already had it saved. That way back in our vendor, we can set our chest index, which I don't know why I called it chest index. This is vendor index. Maybe you caught that, maybe you didn't. Same thing with vendor info. That makes sense. That's called chest index. This needs to be called vendor. Same thing with the local. This needs to be local vendor index. Maybe you caught that, maybe you didn't. I just caught it, so we're just going to change it there. And now we are properly seeing vendor index. So here we're going to make this vendor save data. and that is going to take the inventory currency. Whoops, not inventory size. We don't need inventory size at all. Currency and unique ID. And we need to use our last replen here, because again, we are only ever going to be calling this if we've changed something. And we're just going to make a quick little function here called get vendor display name. That's going to be a little pure function. And that's just so I don't have to break this open every time I need it. I'm going to break it and return the vendor display name. Because I'm also going to need that. If you remember earlier in the video, I said we still need to set up our transfer details. And that's where I'm going to get this get vendor display name. And I'm going to plug that in. And I know I said to plug inventory size in, but since vendors don't have capacity, I'm going to plug this into 9,999,000. And I'll show you again eventually that we'll make sure that in our AC inventory, if we don't have a capacity, that will be the value that is set by default when it runs. So now back in our event graph, we can just get that vendor display name right out here. I don't have to break all that stuff open. And again, we're just making sure that basically the most relevant values have been saved. We don't want to use the vendor defaults to save all this stuff, or it's going to be the default values, right? And we don't want to save the default values. We want to save the live values. Then we're going to try to save the game. And if we successfully save the game, we need to start running our resupply timer, which is going to be run off of this check resupply ready that we haven't done anything with yet. And that is all we're going to do for saving the vendor data. Now, check resupply ready is basically going to be the control of whether or not we are going to run the timer. So we need a custom event here called start resupply timer. And that is going to set timer by event. And if you're doing something like global vendors, you're probably going to do this in the game mode and not in the vendor. But, you know, we're not doing multiplayer or global vendors. So we're just going to check this every 60 seconds, promote this to a variable called replen timer handle. That way we can stop it whenever we need to and make sure it loops. So every 60 seconds, once this has been started, we are going to check this resupply ready as well. But we don't just want to start this like on event begin play, because what if we don't need a resupply, right? What if our defaults is the same as our current inventory? Then we don't need to run this timer all the time, right? We don't need to check for a resupply because we're at the default values. There's nothing to resupply. So resupply is going to work pretty simply. We're going to get UTC now. Not get UTC now, it's just UTC now. We're going to take our last replen date time value here, and we're going to subtract date time minus date time. We're going to get the total seconds, and we're going to see if that is greater than, or I guess equal to, our resupply frequency that we set up. We're going to check that. And if that is true, we're going to run a custom event called resupply. And if that is false, we're going to run a branch. And we're going to see if this timer handle that we just made is valid. Because we need to know if this timer is already running or not. So we don't need a resupply yet, right? We haven't elapsed enough time. Well, we need to make sure that this timer handle is getting started if it needs to get started. So same thing with resupply. We're going to make a little custom function here called IsDefaultInventory. And this is going to check to see if our inventory is default or not. But for now, we're just going to make the pure function called IsDefaultInventory. And it is going to be a pure function that returns a Boolean. That's all we need to know for now. True default is what we're going to call that output there. That way we have a descriptor for it. And we're just going to drag that in here. So we need to see if it is the default inventory. And we also need to make sure that we are not using total refresh. Because if we are using a cumulative refresh system, then we want to always be resupplying the vendor. That way they keep adding on to their inventory. Again, that's kind of an edge case, something you're going to have to decide whether you want to do or not. I'm probably never going to use this. So if the inventory is true, it is default, and we are using total refresh, then we don't need to do anything. Okay? We don't need to do anything at all. We don't need to start the timer. We don't need to do just anything at all. So if this is false, we can start resupply timer. Because that means that either our inventory is not default or we are not using total refresh. So we need to start the resupply timer and allow that to tick, tick, tock. And that is fine. That's all we're going to do here. And I'm going to add an event log just so I kind of know what's going on here. Just so I know what's going on here. This one's going to say default vendor inventory, and I'm going to add another one called resupply timer started. And again, that's just so that we don't actually just keep running this resupply timer for absolutely no reason. So if the timer handle is not valid, we're going to check all of this stuff. But let's say we just resupplied. We need to actually take this timer handle, and if this timer handle is valid, we need to go ahead and clear and invalidate the timer by handle. That way there's some kind of logic going on here that says, okay, the timer handle was valid. Let's go ahead and clear it, and then we'll just restart it once we've checked to see if our inventory and total refresh is not true. So technically, you don't even need to loop this because we're going to be restarting it on every loop. But it's just kind of something that I like to have here. And you're going to adjust this as needed. But basically, just know that every time we check resupply ready, we're going to be checking if the UTC now is the total seconds between the UTC now and the last replen is more than the resupply frequency. And if that's true, we're going to go ahead and resupply. And if that's false, we need to check and see if the timer handle is valid. If the timer handle is valid for pretty much any reason at all, we're going to go ahead and clear it. And then we're going to check and see if our default inventory and total refresh are true, right? So we have the default inventory and we're using total refresh. If that's true, we're not going to do anything. We don't need to do anything. We don't need to run the timer. We don't need to try to resupply again or do any of that stuff. If that is false, the inventory is not default or you're not using total refresh, then we need to start the resupply timer. And in another 60 seconds, it's going to run this check resupply ready, and we're going to check and see if it's ready for a resupply. If it is, we're going to resupply, and either way, we're going to do all that logic again. So this doesn't actually need to be looping. We'll just turn off looping. Looping doesn't really matter, since we're going to be manually kind of setting that anyway. And that's because, again, when we load the game, we're going to be checking this resupply ready instead of just starting the timer. That way, if we don't even need to start the timer, we won't have to. Not that I think this will get too expensive in my example project, but if you have 150 vendors in your game, and they're each running this timer all of the time for absolutely no reason, that's a lot of bloat that doesn't really need to happen. So just a little something there to kind of keep the damage down, right? Keep the game optimized a little bit there. So on resupply, we need to do a few things, right? And this is going to be, I believe, the last function in here that we really need to do. On resupply, we're going to get our UTC now. And we're going to set that to our last resupply time. Now you might want to handle last replen different. You might want to handle this as like an inventory change time, but I just did it from last replen. We're going to get our use total refresh, and we're going to branch. If we are using total refresh, okay, if we are using total refresh, we need to go ahead and get our defaults, and we just need to get our inventory like we did up here, where we didn't have anything going on, and we need to use our defaults, okay? So we're going to get our AC inventory, we're going to set our inventory and load our inventory just to the default values. So we're going to break that open, and we are going to set inventory and set currency to the default values. And then we're going to delay until next tick. That way everything is nice and set up. And we're going to save vendor data. But the first thing I want to do here is actually check. Okay, and we're going to check and see if this use total refresh is true. Instead of saving the vendor data, we're going to clear the vendor data. Okay, something I forgot to do in my other project. I'll just make a little note of that. So let's go into our save custom, and we will make another little function here called clear vendor data. And this is going to be pretty simple. This is going to take the index again. We're going to see if it's -1. If it's -1, we don't need to do anything at all. If it's not -1, we're going to take our vendor data and we're going to remove the index. Whoops. Remove the index of this index. And we're going to go ahead and return our index of -1. And we don't need the vendor to save anymore either. And this is just going to be basically if we already had a valid index that got pulled through when we loaded the vendor. Okay, if we found a valid index when we loaded up this vendor and we set this to something that was not -1, well, when we resupply and we come in here and save, we're going to get valid save game ref. And we are going to remove what did I just call that? Clear. Whoops. We don't want to call that clear. Clear is kind of not the right thing to call that. We're going to call it remove vendor data, because clear would suggest that we're clearing the entire array. We're not clearing the entire array. We're just removing this index from that vendor. So we're going to take the vendor index, and then we're going to set the vendor index. And this is just in case maybe you haven't like restarted the game and you've gone to the vendor, but the vendor was valid, right? The vendor had items, you traded with the vendor, and then it's been 10 minutes or it's been 10 hours, right? I've been known to play games for 10 hours straight. And the vendor got removed. If we still have that same stale index coming in as whatever it was, 15, 5, 3, that is going to totally mess up your vendor. Your vendor is going to get invalid data. It's going to get somebody else's data, or it's going to get an invalid pull. So that's why when we remove the vendor data, we need to make sure that we're putting out -1. This index no longer exists. So that next time when we check the vendor data, when we try to save it, it's going to give us that -1. So if we then trade with our vendor again and save our vendor data, that index is going to be -1, and that's going to make us add a new vendor to that vendor data. So just kind of a check there to make sure that we are properly setting that vendor index back to -1, because it no longer exists inside of the save data. Now, if we are not using a total refresh, that means we are adding these vendor defaults to the inventory and the currency. So we need to go ahead and save the vendor data here. So basically what we're going to do here is we are going to take our AC inventory. We are going to set currency, or I should say add, or adjust is what we called it, adjust currency. So off of the false, we're going to adjust the currency. We're going to take the amount of change, and we're just going to plug currency right in there. And we are going to go ahead and add to inventory. And we're going to run a for each loop through this entire inventory array of their defaults. and go ahead and add all of those defaults into the vendor's inventory and save. So we're going to delay until next tick. Save vendor data. And then that way we don't get we don't get carried away on this one up here. I'm going to go ahead and try save game async. And that way we just kind of save that this vendor has been removed because we already save in the end of our vendor data loop. So we're just going to save that this vendor was properly removed. Now you can see why not using total refresh can get a little dangerous, right? Eventually you're going to have billions and billions of items inside of this vendor. So that is why I'm not going to be using this at all. You would probably want to use this on something like an investment banker or an investment vendor where you're not really having items added, or maybe you're only having 5 carrots added or some nonsense like that, and you're really just increasing the currency. This is going to be up to you to adjust as needed. Just know that using this, or I should say not using total refresh, can be very dangerous here, because every vendor that doesn't use that is going to have to constantly be saved into the save game, and they're going to be constantly adding on to their currency and inventory. So eventually this will run away. Okay? And we're going to caption that, and we're going to say resupply vendor, or something like that, since we're all done with it. Again, when we do our just default resupply, we can just go ahead and remove them from the save game array. And if we don't, we're going to be adding all those values in and making sure that we do properly save this vendor into the array, all of their new data. So we have one more little function here, IsDefaultInventory. We need to make sure that we do this before we forget. And this is going to basically just check and see if all of the items in our inventory are, whoops, not for each, my bad. I'm going to run a branch. It's basically just going to check and see if all of the items in our current inventory are the same as the vendor's defaults. Okay? Not set defaults, get defaults. So we're going to take our AC inventory. We're going to get inventory content. And we're going to get currency. Currency is going to be the easiest way to check. That's going to be our first check here. If currency equals the vendor default currency, then we can go ahead and pass through true. If it does not equal the vendor default currency here, then we've already failed. So we can go ahead and say we failed. That means that the currency has changed from the defaults into the inventory, right? So something has happened to make the currency changed. Something has been bought or sold. And honestly, we could probably just fail out there and say, hey, it's okay. Just because the currency changed, we're probably good. The odds of having the exact amount of currency you do as your defaults are not high. But they are also not 0. So we're going to run a for each with break. And this for each with break is going to loop through the entire inventory content from our inventory. And it's going to loop through our vendor save data, so our defaults here. And we're going to check and see if the item ID... Oh, whoops. I actually want to get a copy, my bad. Get a copy of the inventory at that index, because it's always going to be the same index if it is the defaults, right? I'm going to break it. And we're going to see if all of these values are equal. So the ID is equal, the quantity is equal, and the enhancement level is equal. So basically, we're just looping through every item to make sure that the entire array matches. I know if you use custom, there's certain plugins you can say match array. I forgot what plugin it is, but I know there's a couple out there that you can go ahead and just match arrays, and if the arrays are exactly the same, then it will return true. So it's something you might want to look into, but we're just going to do it the hard way. We're going to see if everything equals everything, then we're good. We can continue looping through this. And if everything matches everything, by the end of it, right, we need some kind of branch here, or some kind of value from this branch to check. So we're going to see L mismatch. And that's going to be a Boolean. And if this was false for whatever reason, then we had a mismatch. So we're going to set this L mismatch to true. And we're going to go ahead and stop looping because we already know that we do not have the true inventory. And when we return, we're just going to return L mismatch. Because if we looped through, or I'm sorry, not L mismatch. I'm going to return the not of L mismatch. So if we looped through the entire the entire current inventory, and every single item matched the vendor defaults, then this is going to be false because it is not mismatched. So we need to return the true because it is true. This is the default inventory because it is not mismatched. If for whatever reason this triggered false, that means an item ID was not equal to the defaults, or maybe you bought one carrot and you sold like one lettuce and they were the same value. So this passed and the vendor had the same amount of their default currency, but they had plus one carrot and minus one lettuce, or vice versa, then this is going to return false as a mismatch, and it's going to say, okay, yeah, we need to refresh the vendor data when that time comes because it is not the default data. Okay, so pretty simple there. Just hopefully you got that. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave them in the comments section below. But I think that was probably not as complicated as I tried to make it out to be. And that's just going to check if we need to keep looping through this resupply timer. So if that comes up as false, we're going to start the resupply timer and say, okay, in 60 seconds, we're going to need to check and see if something has changed. So check resupply ready. Pretty much any time we do anything inside of our vendor, we're going to need to run that. So when we remove an item, or when we save the inventory, or when we add an item, or when we adjust the currency, we're going to do that, right? Because if we just do it on event begin play, well, that's only going to happen once when the vendor loads up. And yes, it needs to happen here because we need to know if there was valid data in the save. Then we need to use this last resupply time to actually check and see if we need to replenish already. And that's going to go ahead and replenish if needed. If not, we're not really doing anything with that. We're just loading up the inventory. But that's the only time, okay, we're actually checking, except for on save. So we're actually checking at the end of save, so we don't need to do it there. But that's the only time we're actually checking if anything has changed to start this resupply. So, yeah, we're actually going to do that off of false here. My bad. I should have mentioned this earlier. To keep that infinite loop up, we're going to check resupply ready off of the false. That way it starts up that loop when we are infinitely adding to their inventory. Again, I don't know why I added that. You probably shouldn't add that. I'm going to check our resupply ready on remove item. We're going to check our resupply ready on add to inventory, or we can check our resupply ready on add currency. But we only need to do this because we save on this save trigger. We only need to do this if we didn't save. And if you remember correctly, if I remember correctly, I should say, in the UI for the transfer widget, which is going to be the one controlling all this stuff, when we made our adjust currency amounts, I believe, no. When we made our, where is it? Where did I put it? Transfer item buttons, which is this complicated gobbledygook. I believe at the very end, yes, we triggered save on both the player and the other actor. So when an item is removed, or so I should say, when an item is bought or sold, we are going to make sure that we trigger this save inventory. And that's going to work with the currency as well. I'm going to run over to our vendor. And we are going to trade with our vendor. Hopefully this works. Okay, we can see that our vendor has all of their default stuff in here. So we're going to buy these. Oh, I'm not buying 50 gold helmets. No, thank you. No, sir. I don't want 50 gold helmets. I'm going to buy these XP boosts. I don't have 50 million gold. I'm going to buy these chicken meals for 50k. It's nice and nice cheap chicken meals. I have 50,000 currency. The bank does not. So when I purchase items, it should let me purchase them. If I were to try to sell all of these max enhancement cores, it should not let me because the vendor here does not have enough money. So if I were to quit the vendor here and very quickly come in here, that should have saved the last replen time, should have saved when I interacted with the vendor to the time when the vendor spawned on. So it's not a big deal that everything is perfect. vendor loaded at index X. And if we are returning -1 here, that would be our problem. So yeah, vendor loaded at -1. That should not be happening. Trade with the vendor. Buy our chicken meals. Vendor saved at index 0. When I press play, yep, the vendor loaded at index 1. Now why, oh why, did the vendor load at index 1? So basically we're going to have to change this set vendor data slightly, because for some reason it was not accepting this in index and this little bit of logic we were doing here to, if the in index was equal to -1, we were supposed to just be adding the vendor data to the new vendor data to the save array and getting the index. For some reason that was working, and it was outputting the right index, but it wasn't actually adding this vendor save data to this vendor data array. And honestly, I have no idea why. It also wasn't working off of the false here either. So we're going to go ahead and delete all that. And instead of bringing in this in index, and we don't need our out index technically either, what we are going to do here, well, I'm going to keep that out index. Never mind. I'm going to keep that out index for debugging just for right now so we can see. But what we're going to do here is on our set vendor data, we're going to take our current vendor data. We're going to do a for each loop with break. I know I wanted to make this easier for you, but I guess I can't. Inside of the loop body, if the unique ID that is stored within the vendor data is equal to the incoming vendor's unique ID, so the same thing we did when we found the vendor index to load. If those are equal, that is true. We're going to set this new local variable to actually be local index found or something to that effect. And then we're going to set the array element in the vendor data here to the new vendor save data that is coming in. I know, a bit of a pain, but we're going to do that. And then we're going to do a break. So if we found the vendor, then we're going to break. If we did not find the vendor, we need to check and see if the default value of local index, which is -1, is true. If that is true, if it is at the default value of -1, we're going to add it to the array. If not, we're just going to output that local variable for debugging. That way we can see it. And basically we're just not going to use that at all inside of vendor. So we don't need this in index and we don't need to save this at all. But I'm still going to keep it here for just debugging for now. And again, I'm not entirely sure why that wasn't working, but we can see now when we load, we're loading at index 0 and index 1. And all of the changes that we've made inside the vendor are properly loading up here. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure why that wasn't working. We also went through and we added the save game check to the vendor data. That didn't trigger it to work. And the save custom, we added the save game to the advanced settings in the array. And that didn't get it to work. So I guess ultimately the thing is we just have to run through this for each loop with break, loop through the entire array, and see if we can find the vendor that way. And that is just how we are going to have to return that. That's just how we're going to have to set the save data. So not 100% sure why it wouldn't work the way that we set it up the first time, but this is nothing new here. This is pretty much the exact same thing we did when we tried to find the vendor index. So yeah, that's pretty much all we're gonna do here. So if instead of returning the vendor index, you just wanted to go ahead and return the array element, you could do that here, or you could get a copy of it right here and return that array element for vendor. Since we're not going to be using this vendor index for anything at all, this is just going to get saved here again for debugging purposes. I might try some stuff later on to check that, but on load, we really don't need to do that anymore. We can just get the vendor data if you want to clean it up a little bit. So I'm going to remove a couple of these event logs. Actually, I'm going to keep these event logs for now. Just because I'm really not 100% sure why that didn't work. And then we are also going to go in and change our resupply frequency to 60 seconds because I want to see if this is properly resupplying. And I think I said we could leave looping off. We do want looping on. I noticed it wasn't actually printing this vendor is ready or vendor is not ready every 60 seconds while I was testing. I checked that value too and it did not do it. So Say vendor is ready, removed from save, vendor removed from save. That is good. So it loaded them up at the proper indexes and then it removed them from the save. So now if I were to exit this game again and come back in, so say vendor loaded at -1 and 0. It just means that nothing actually happened. Default vendor inventory. Right, vendor is ready, saving. So we're going to buy our chicken meal. Vendor saved at index 0. Vendor is not ready. And we're going to buy, we'll just sell a sword. Vendor saved at index 1. Vendor is not ready. And I'm guessing it's not starting the timer, probably because we're stopping the timer or invalidating it too quickly. That would be my best guess because it's been 10 seconds already and we should have seen the pop-up for vendor not ready. Yeah, we should have seen that pop-up for vendor not ready by now. So it is something with this clear and invalidates timer handle, probably. If we don't actually do that, right, and we just start the timer based on that, it should work out just fine. And maybe on resupply, I will actually take this and clear the timer handle when we do resupply. Boop. 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 So on resupply, we'll clear and invalidate that timer handle. And now that should be ticking away, hopefully. It should have already ticked away, right? Vendor removed from save, vendor removed from save. That means they were ready and they got put at their default values. We'll try one more time to buy our chicken meals. And hopefully in 10 seconds that will pop on through. The vendor got saved at index 1. Not really sure why. And that vendor is now index 0. Whatever. Doesn't matter too much which index they're at as long as they are properly loading and saving. That's all I really care about. Oh no. Jump to book. What the heck? So vendor not ready, vendor not ready. Timer started, timer started. Let's wait our 10 seconds here and hopefully that will tick that timer. And we got the vendor not ready, vendor not ready. So it did tick that timer. And if we wait a minute, I'm sure it will probably restock the vendors. Yeah, vendor removed from inventory and vendor saved. So after that 60 seconds was up, it removed them from there. I don't want that. I'm just going to buy one chicken meal since I'm running out of money. Vendor got saved at index 0. This vendor properly restocked. And now is saved at index 1. So those indexes are always going to constantly change around and flip-flop. But, you know, that's fine. I don't think it matters too much. We see that the timer is not running when they're at the default inventory, and the timer is running when they are not at the default inventory. So everything is working as intended. We see that again every 10 seconds it's ticking that little message there that the vendor is not ready. And when the vendor becomes ready, it's going to remove them from the save array, and then it's going to stop ticking this timer. So that's great, all hunky-dory there. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments section below, and we will try to work with whatever errors we may have encountered here. I don't think there are any more errors other than the save not saving for some reason. But when we do this for each loop here, it is actually properly saving. And we see that the timer is properly stopped when the default inventory is true. Alright, so I know we got a little carried away there, but I'm going to reset my timer to something reasonable like 60 seconds. I'm going to set the resupply frequency to 600. You might want to set this to 24 hours, or basically however long it's going to take your vendor to restock. We're going to make sure I'm still going to be using this vendor index when I save my vendor data. That way it still works here with my remove vendor data. I can pass that index in and properly remove the vendor from the array, because that was working just fine. And I think that is about all we need to do here to clean it up. I cleaned up my debug function, and I think we are about good here. So I'm going to make sure we compile, save everything, and we should be good to go. Make sure I delete all this as well. We no longer have the print last replen, and we don't need this debug key 7 anymore. Just a little bit of debugging there. So hopefully you followed along. Again, if you have any questions, make sure to let me know in the comments section below. That was our BP vendor. So when I drag these vendors out into the world, I'm going to go ahead and make them now. We have, I believe, 6 data table rows. Let's check real quick. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yes, we have 6. So I want 6 vendors in my game. And we're going to set all these to their proper data table row. That way I just kind of have the items in here. We're going to be using these items at a later date to craft different objects because we didn't add in herbs or anything like that in the gathering examples. You can add them in as you want. It's literally just this gathering node set to the item ID of herbs, but I didn't feel like adding any in. I did that through the buy sell. So that takes care of all of our transfer widgets. So that is the banker, which uses the transfer, and that is these storage chests that use the transfer. But yeah, that was all of our transfer widgets. So in the next episode, we are going to go ahead and add in our last NPC, and that is going to be our class giver NPC. Sorry, not quest giver, class giver. And all that's going to happen when we interact with that NPC is we're just going to pick up the gathering class or the crafting class that it holds. So that'll be a nice short episode, and maybe we'll get some cleanup done and set up some of the other crafting tables as well in the game. If you're enjoying the videos so far, I urge you to join our Patreon. For just $3 a month, you'll get access to all of the videos in this series as soon as I create them. Always available on Patreon, always free and ready to go. You'll also get a copy of the example project so you can follow along step by step with a real visual guide in the project.